time for some more kitchen table astronomy with Hampshire College astronomer and the head of Kainat Studios, Salman Hameed, at your Amherst kitchen table. First of all, Dr. Salman Hameed, Mr. Universe, you're going to be part of 413 Day this Sunday.
Woohoo! Yes.
Salman Hameed live on stage talking with me and Khalees about some fun facts from the universe that may or may not tie into what we do here in Western Mass. Although technically, all of it ties into what we do here in Western Mass, because where did the Big Bang happen? Western Mass.
That is correct.
And also everywhere.
And I'm pretty sure that within the Milky Way, this whole area probably falls under 413.
It does, yeah.
Like, so I think this whole solar neighborhood and that all, I think it's 413.
The other news coming up this week is NASA news, because tomorrow there will be a hearing for the new Trump administration appointed head of NASA.
Yes, so on April 9th, 10 a.m. Eastern, is the hearing for Jared Isaacman to be the head of NASA. And tune into that. The things to really focus on, if you look into that, is the future of NASA, or the direction of NASA. We have talked about before, a lot of things have been on chopping block, including a lot of jobs have been cut. About 900 agency servants have already left. There is a closure of 3 offices at NASA headquarters. And so those things have already taken place. But I think a big issue is whether the focus is going to be going back to the moon. The way, it was in the first Trump administration that was one of the goals, to get humans back to the moon, or is it going to be Elon Musk's pet project of going directly to Mars? And so I think this is one of those things that we will have to see.
The Trump administration has also set their sights on Greenland. They sent J.D. Vance and his wife over there to try to court Greenland into becoming part of the United States. Astronomers have already, sadly, successfully colonized Greenland in some way.
Well, not exactly, but I thought, when we have been talking about a lot of things that are happening right now in the U.S. and in terms of for science and other things, I've always said sort of focus on small things. Look at smaller examples. And the way the language is being used regarding Greenland, and especially our Vice President, J.D. Vance, when he went over there, I think it's good to have other contexts as well. And at places where, for example, if we now feel sad about the actions that we took a while back, and there is a particular astronomy connection, and that is to do with a meteoroid, and it's iron meteoroid. And Monty, a few years ago, you and I talked about a fascinating thing, that there was an iron dagger that was found in King Tut's belongings. And it was surprising because the technology to produce iron at that time was not there, but you still could have iron because it could fall from the sky.
Awesome.
And so that's exactly what it was. In fact, there is also a hieroglyphic symbol for that type of iron, meteoric iron, which is called sort of like metal of the sky. So it's very appropriate in that sense. And in the same way, when there was the first European contact with Inuits in Greenland, they found that actually people were using iron tools. And they had in some ways skipped Stone Age, and they're just actually directly using that. And this was surprising to a certain degree. But as it turns out, that was because there were large pieces of iron meteoroid that was there. Mm-hmm. And so that's part of the story. So the first part of the story is, so these are connected to the Inuits in the north here, but they're a little bit different. They're called Inughuits, so there is a G in there. And they were first contacted with the Europeans, or Western, in that context, Europeans, in first time in 1818, with when the British explorer, there was an expedition by Captain John Ross who went over there, and that's where he noticed sort of like, that they had knives and they had other tools. They had harpoons that they were using for whaling, but those were made up of metal. But they did not find what the source of that metal was. There were other missions that went over there, but they still did not find the source of that iron. But then ultimately, there was Robert Peary, who was part of the U.S. Navy. He was a U.S. naval officer. He was really interested in actually going to the North Pole, to be the first one to go to the North Pole. And
Except Santa.
Except Santa, that is correct. Well, he comes from there. He just
yeah.
lives there.
Yeah, right. That
You
doesn't
don't
count.
go
Doesn't even
there.
count.
That's right. And so Robert Peary, who actually has a local connection as well, he actually went to Bowdoin College in Maine. And so he went over there in 1894, and he actually spent time down there, and he also convinced one of the locals, a local guide, to show him where they are getting those that iron from. Where is that meteorite? Apparently, he gave him a gun, and and the person took him over there, and now we know over there over the period of time, 8 large fragments have been discovered. There was this large iron meteorite that fell, and at the time when Robert Peary was there were 3 large pieces that were there, and they were one of them was called Inughuit sewing woman. So this was like the woman. That one of the pieces was called. The other one was with her tent. So woman with her tent. So it was called the tent. And the third was called and curled up with the dog and was called the dog. So those were the 3 shapes. Now,
And this is the Inuit people's interpretation of what these giant rocks that fell from the sky look like, in the same way that every culture has done it with the stars, making images that feel more familiar and bringing it into their own tradition.
right. So those were linked with the local mythology in terms of how something fell from the sky, and that is there. And so this was part of it. It was supposed to have been hurled from heaven by an evil spirit. But this was useful. I mean, as I said, they were actually creating these tools. And that iron meteorites have been found, or tools made up of that iron have been found across in the sort of like in North America as well. So there clearly was a trade and use of those things, and that was useful, including when the Western Europeans, when they were going over there, they were also trading those things for other materials and stuff like that. So and they were sort of what is called cold forging, meaning to say they were using stones to actually hammer the metal in there to create shapes of knives and things like that. So that was all well and good, but Robert Peary, he decided, well,
And he's the U.S. naval guy, right?
he's a U.S. naval guy, and he decided, well, I mean, if they are there, and we know where they are, we should get them back to the U.S. And so he got the 2 of the smaller fragments. So the total, just to give you an idea, the total iron meteorite that is there is over 58 tons.
Wow.
And the largest one is about 31-ton meteorite. So it's not straightforward. It's not easy to actually transport that. He got the 2 smaller ones back in 1895, but it took him a couple of years to get the last one, the largest one, for which he had to get a bigger ship, which actually got financed through various organizations, including the National Geographic Society, for example, and others. And the largest one, which was the tent, he got it back, and he sold it to the American Museum of Natural History for $40,000, which in today's money, it's going to be about $1.5 million.
So this U.S. naval guy goes to Greenland, sees these 3 giant pieces of an iron meteoroid that fell there that the Inuit people have named and I'm assuming revered to a certain degree and made tools out of, and then takes them and brings them to the United States.
That is correct. And of course, I mean, I could have started with sort of like the larger story. Well, these meteoroids are part of the solar system. They started sort of like 4.5 billion years ago, and then they fell to Greenland. But they have these human stories that are linked to it, and in some sense, that's what adds a different value to it, especially to the local culture and local custom. Mm-hmm. But it was brought to New York, to the American Museum of Natural History, for which you can actually go today and see them as well, see those meteoroids as well. Now, I would have stopped with that and said, okay, well, maybe we should return the meteorite, so on and so forth. We could have had this conversation. But that is not the full conversation. That is not the full part of the story. Because at the Museum of Natural History, American Museum of Natural History, there was the assistant curator over there, Franz Boas, who is considered as sort of like, the future founder of modern anthropology as well. He actually thought, well, I mean, like, if you are coming back, why don't you bring a couple of, or actually he wanted just one, local Inughuit as well. And so this is a person I'm talking about.
A living person.
A living person back as well, so they could study. And Robert Peary actually found 6 of them. And there was a couple with their 12-year-old daughter. And there was another guy who came with them. And then there was another hunter whose wife had actually died earlier on because of some of the diseases that actually the Europeans had brought in, or the Americans, and then and his 7-year-old son. His name was Minnik. And those 6 Inuits were part of the 1897 when the ship was coming in. They were all part of additional supplementary thing to the largest iron meteoroid that was brought in. The ship first actually went to Boston as well, where people actually went in and saw the meteoroid. It was a public attraction, including they also saw the 6 Inuits over there as well. And then the ship went to New York, and the reports are like, there were over 20,000 people that went to see the meteoroid and the locals that were brought in. And again, the idea was they were promised that they come over here, they will be given stuff from the US, and then they will be shipped back in a year. But that's not what happened. When they came over here, they were sort of like, they were settled into the basement of American Museum of Natural History, which was damp and it was warm, something that none of them were actually ever used to, living in Greenland for all of their lives. And all of them actually got hospitalized, and 4 of them died actually within a few months of getting here. Including the father of Minnik, the person that I was mentioning. His father also died. One of the persons actually wanted to go back, and he was actually sent back relatively early. But Minnik, the 7-year-old boy, was told that his father had died and he had been buried and things like that. But in reality, that's not what had happened. In fact, when he had died, his remains were actually kept to study, and he was not given a burial. Minnik himself was then adopted. He was actually by one of the employees of the American Museum of Natural History, and basically he was the only one from Greenland, the Inuits, who was in New York, and he was like 9 years old, and he stayed over here.
Because everyone else had either died or gone back.
That's exactly right. And Robert Peary he didn't come back and to keep the promise that he had said, like,
the U.S. Navy guy who brought all these iron meteoroids back, he's promising to bring the Inuits back to Greenland. Minnik, no, he just ditches them.
Yeah, and Minnik, and he somehow, and it's unclear. There are different ways people are talk about it. Like, he somehow found out that his father's remains actually are stored in the American Museum of Natural History. And in fact, maybe from there or not, but certainly his brain, his father's brain anatomy was actually put into a 1901 report also, like, that how it is and so on and so forth. And he started to write when he got a little bit older in the newspapers to get his father's remains back to Greenland. And but with not much success. But eventually, he in fact even wrote to Robert Peary. He was like, hey, I really want to go back. And Robert Peary kept on saying that, like, there was no space in the ship that can go. But then in 1909, Robert Peary himself, so there is a parallel story of it, which is also interesting because he did end up potentially making a claim of reaching the North Pole, which was later disputed. That and what historians now think is like, he was about 60 miles short of the North Pole. But one of the reasons why he was more successful in getting there was partly because of these Inuits helping him with the local dog sleds he had shown, and he had shown interest in the local customs as well, to learn about their customs. But ultimately, he made a claim that he had reached the North Pole, which was not tested. There is a whole side story of that because his assistant or his helper, who's African American, he was the one potentially who have reached it, but not him. But in 1909, he wanted to come back and actually because that's what was considered, that he was the first person to actually reach the North Pole. But at the same time, Minnik was writing in the newspapers about his treatment of his father and also what had happened over there. And so suddenly, one ship was going to Greenland, Robert Peary, and he found space for Minnik to be out of the U.S. probably because of avoiding bad publicity. Mm-hmm. And just again, this is just one example where this is something that happened about 100 years ago, over 100 years ago. And today, if we hear something like this, it's heart-wrenching, and it's something that we would say, it's definitely wrong. And at the time, people did that. And so this is just a reminder that when we are thinking about a lot of things that are happening today, people use, of course, that what's happening in Gaza, or people talk about sort of genocide and other things like that, and people go like, well, how we are going to look back. In fact, there is a new book out which actually writes about how people are going to talk about this stuff from the future. This is another example. This is a much smaller example, but today, when we think about what Robert Peary did, I don't think there will be many people who say, he did the right thing. No, people are like, no.
He took 6 Inuits from Greenland and 3 giant pieces of their meteorite that fell in Greenland that was made out of iron, brought them to the United States. Almost all of them died, and then he wouldn't bring the little kid back when he wanted to go, nor his father's remains.
And his father's remains were used for scientific purposes,
right,
for analysis. And today you go like, yeah, that wasn't good. So this is the perspective that I just wanted to give you this small story. And Minnik himself, he wrote other things too, but he said in one of his articles, like, my father was taken from me, a martyr to the cold-blooded scientific study of your people. His body was refused a burial even after he gave his life to your science. Right, and then when he was leaving, the reporter actually asked him a question right in 1909, and he said, this is his quote from Minnik, the little boy who was left, and now he was 10 years later, and he said, "You are a race of scientific criminals. I know I will never get my father's bones out of the American Museum of Natural History. I'm glad enough to get away before they grab my brains and stuff them into a jar." He did go back to Greenland. He didn't know the ways. He wasn't trained over there. He learned them, but he never could adjust over there. He did come back to the U.S., and he died in 1918, I think, or around that, the influenza pandemic. And then later on in the 1980s, this case, there was a famous book actually that brought it up together, and that's when the American Museum of Natural History repatriated the bones back to Greenland, I think in the early 1990s. So, but if you go to the American Museum of Natural History, it is on display, these meteoroids. They do acknowledge that it came from the Inuits. It was taken from there, but the full context is not there. And they do acknowledge, the American Museum of Natural History, not officially in there, but they have acknowledged that, well, what they say, mistakes were made, or or they said sort of like that it was, some of it was unethical, but that's part of the story, and. And this is not an isolated one as well. There, we'll talk at some other time. There was another meteoroid in Portland area. It's a similar type of a story, not with the locals in there, but certainly it was important to the Native American community over there. But that meteoroid also, it's a Tomanowos meteoroid that was also brought to the American Museum of Natural History at the beginning of the 20th century, and that is also there.
A cautionary tale from the world of astronomy about messing with Greenland. And maybe we have not yet learned our lesson.
I don't think it would be a cautionary about messing with Greenland. I think this is more about
respecting Greenland.
About us. I mean, if we think this is wrong, what was done in the early 20th century, I think that is important to know that what we are doing today, including, for example, looking for minerals in Greenland, potentially without respecting the locals. And it extends to Denmark as well, because one of the meteorites that was later discovered actually ended up in a museum over there, and there is a history of that as well, but not with the locals. I mean, I think this particular story with Robert Peary got a little worse because of bringing the locals alongside with that, and their treatment and how we treated other human beings.